Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be going over 5 tips to instantly improve your dovetails. Now it's worth saying this is not a replacement video for my video on how to cut a through dovetail or how to cut a lap dovetail. It's just going to summarise a few of the points in that video plus a little more. So what I would suggest is watch those first, get the technique, get the whole process sorted out, and then you can come back here for reference on a few extra tips that are going to help you out. So the first tip that I'm going to show you is the invisible baseline method, which as far as I'm aware is something that was used by Alan Peters. Basically what this allows you to do is clean up the marking gauge lines at the end of dovetailing as easy as possible because they're not actually there in the first place. So let me show you that now. Right, so the invisible baseline method. What we're going to do is get our two components that are due to be nested together, and instead of setting the marking gauge to the thickness of one component and scratching all the way around to the corresponding component, what we're going to do is mark the width of it on with a pencil first. So I'm going to get the thickness of this one, I'm going to put it up so it's flush against the end grain on the bottom here, so that shows how much it needs to be inset, and draw a line along there and on the opposite side as well. Doesn't need to be too accurate, but it needs to be accurate enough if that gives you any sort of tolerance to work to. So draw that on both sides of the components, and then you can clamp your tailboard up in the vise and work out the spacing for the dovetails. So on this side now I'm just going to do it roughly, obviously for the sake of time. There you go, so mark our dovetails on there, square it across the end grain nice and square and down to that pencil line that we've drawn on there just now. Okay, and then just mark our waist, and then all you've got to do is get your marking gauge, set that to the thickness of your pin board on here. So the pencil line was kind of accurate, this is what is going to be our accurate one, so marking gauge is set to the thickness of the pin board, and then you can take that out of the vise, and because you've already got your dovetails marked out, you've only got a scratch in those waist areas. And obviously because of this you can make these marking gauge lines nice and deep, so it's very easy to register your chisel into. You haven't got to worry about removing them later. So the edge, obviously we're going to remove that, it's all fine. And the inside face, you can mark this out the same as we've done here if you want, but it's the inside face, doesn't matter if there's a scratch all the way along that as well. And obviously the other edge as well. And that's pretty much all there is to the invisible baseline. So obviously when it comes to chopping out that waist, your chisel's going to be able to go into that line that you scratched with the marking gauge, but you're not going to have any marking gauge scratched on the tails that are going to be left over at the end. So this is going to be great for drawers, for example, where maybe you cut that marking gauge line too deep. You want to plane it out, but then by the time you plane it out, you've made that drawer too small to fit into a cavity. Use the invisible baseline method and that will help you a great deal. Now the second technique I'm going to be showing you is gang cutting. Now all gang cutting is clamping two bits of material that are due to be dovetailed in the vise at the same time, so you cut two sets of tails at once. And this has three main advantages. The first one being it makes it a lot easier to cut square across the end grain. The second being it makes the process of dovetailing a little bit quicker. And thirdly, it allows more consistency between your components. So if you cut these at the same time and then split them either side of a drawer, for example, then your tails are exactly the same on either side. So let me show you that now. So here you go, here's our two components that are due to be nested together. So on this, I've done the pencil line down the bottom so we can still mix in the invisible baseline technique if we wanted. So get them clamped in the vise, same height, and make sure the edges are perfectly flush. So don't only check at the top, but also check at the bottom as well, because you don't want them to be twisted in here. So there we go, that's all nice now. Now I'll do the same spacing as before, whatever that was, and then draw the dovetails across the end grain and down this front component. And there we go. So now when it comes to cutting out this component, if these were thinner, it makes it a little bit more difficult to work out if your square is on the end grain. A way of doing it is you can look at the reflection of the saw, and if it looks like the material is going straight through the saw in a complete line, then it's obviously pretty square. If you crank it off like this, you can see that the reflection is angled like that. But I don't know, maybe your saw isn't as shiny as this one. So by having this longer reference line on there, it means that it's a lot easier to get that saw square across the end grain like that. And there you go, so you can imagine if I cut all those out, they're going to be exactly the same size. You're going to have a much better chance of that end grain being square, and it's made the process quicker as well. And there you go, so that is gang cutting. Now one thing to look out for when you're doing this, obviously you're doubling the material thickness. So like I said, this is very good for thin components, but if the material is as thick as what I'm demonstrating on here, you have to be careful when sawing because it's going to be a lot more difficult to saw through, and if your technique's a little bit ropey, should we say, then you're going to struggle quite a lot with getting it accurate while cutting through the thickness. So if you're not entirely sure on your sawing technique, maybe have a look at my video on how to saw correctly. I'll put the link of it in the top corner now, because that will help you with cutting various joints out, especially dovetails. So the next tip I'm going to share with you is using a dovetail guide. Let me just get them out of my cabinet. Okay, so dovetail guides. We have two makes here. This one is by David Barron, and these two here are from Jonathan Katz-Moses. And these come in various angles. So this one is a 1:6, and we have a 1:6 here and a 1:8 ratio. And what these allow you to do is, like I said with gang cutting, the most important thing about dovetailing is cutting square across the end grain. The angle of the dovetail itself, not massively important, within reason obviously. You don't want it being too steep because that makes the corners too fragile, and too shallow, you might as well just cut a finger joint. If you want to know a bit more about dovetail ratios, I did a video on that, so maybe have a look at that first. But what these allow you to do is cut perfectly square across the end grain and also get that angle of them spot on, so you have nice consistency across all of your pieces. So the way it works is clamp your tail board up in the vise like this. And what you can do is grab the guide, and this has a little magnet on the side like this. So you can put that up against the mark on your component, and the saw is going to hit that magnet and stay perfectly square across the end grain. And it's also going to be guided down the cuts at the perfect ratio. So let's just scratch a baseline on there to work to. So there you go, it makes the process nice and easy. So let's get the Katz-Moses one here. So up against the side of the tail, saw gets held in place. And voila, perfectly square across the end grain and a perfect angle cut. Now, if you want to cut the left-hand side of the tails, you can simply flip the jig around, and if you're ambidextrous like me, you can work from the other side like this and saw with your left hand, or alternatively, just flip it around in the vise like that, and you can still use your dominant hand to cut down those tails. And then voila, perfectly square cuts across there, perfectly angled down the front. You have nice consistent dovetails. Now you're probably saying at this point, well, that's great, Matt, but that's only half a dovetail joint. What about the pin side of it? What you can do with your pins marked out on the end grain, so I'll draw them on here just so you can see them a little bit easier. So instead of holding the jig like this and sawing down it on that face, you can simply flip it round like that and slide it up against your knife line. So there you go, it's holding it at the exact angle that I sawed it at when I was sawing the tails, but now it's flipped around the other way, and it's going to ensure a perfect joint. So there you go, that's the David Barron one, and the Jonathan Katz-Moses one, you just use one of the four faces on the bottom, up against the side, and flip it around. You can work on the other one. And then obviously it's the same thing as the tails. If you're ambidextrous, you could work on that outside face with either of the jigs, or you could just simply flip it round if that makes it a little bit easier for you. Or alternatively, just hold the dovetail jig on the back like that, and you've still got that angle. So there we go, that's dovetail guides, and like I say, these are great for beginners. Like, you can literally never cut a dovetail before, pick up one of these and you'll be able to cut one perfect straight off the saw. It's not cheating, it's just a different method of doing so don't be conscious of that. They're still hand-cut dovetails. So if you want to know a little bit more about the difference between these two guides, I did a tool duel comparing the David Barron guide and the Katz-Moses guide. Link to that is up there if you want to watch that. And let's move on to the next tip, which is the Vee Groove on the back of the component. And what this allows you to do is make the process of transferring the tails onto the pin board a lot easier and a lot more repeatable and accurate. So let me show you that now. So some of you may have seen the technique where you cut a rabbet or a rebate on the back of the tails, and then that allows you to slide it up against the pin board and it kind of locks it in place. And that is a great technique, but it relies on you having a shoulder plane, a rebate plane or something like that, and not all of us have that obviously. So what you can do you remember at the start in the invisible baseline technique, I said that you could still scratch the marking gauge line across the back of the tails. On the front here, you don't need to do that, but on the back, you can scratch it all the way along. So when it comes to scratching that marking gauge line along the back, make it pretty deep, because then what you can do is get a chisel and come in from the tail side, and then starting a few millimeters back, angle it up and wiggle it down to hit that marking gauge line. And what this is doing is creating a little V groove that's angled down on the tail side, and then it's hitting a vertical wall on the shoulder line. And you notice I'm holding the chisel down the bottom here, I'm not holding it up the top like this, because if I slip then that's going to probably chop my thumb off. So hold it down the bottom and then just do little wiggles, make sure that it's nice and sharp, and cut a little V groove on the back of your tails. And there we go. So then what you can do is get your pin board in the vise. So we're going to clamp this with the face side out, get a component behind it, and we're going to make it so that the pin board here is sitting about 1 millimeter above that component behind. Clamp it in place, and then you'll see when we get this pin board on there, And you see, it's getting a positive lock on that shoulder line there. So then what I can do is pop a chisel on the face edge here, and then I can use that as my alignment and then slide this up until it hits that little V groove, and that is holding it spot on in place. And it's great because if you're doing a really wide component or something like that you're dovetailing, maybe you get halfway along it and it slips. It is a nightmare to try and realign. Whereas with this method, with that little V groove on the back, you know that all you've got to do is put your chisel on the edge like that, slide it up to hit the V groove, and you've got it in exactly the same position as before. Obviously, you don't want it to slip in the first place because you are going to still lose a little bit of accuracy with doing this, but it's going to give you the best possible chances of getting it in the same place again. Then trace around that as normal, nice and easy, and voila, there is the pins cut out, and you're not having to affect the thickness of the tails or anything like that by cutting a rabbet in the back. It's all exactly the same thickness. You've just taken a little notch out the bottom here to help you with that location there. So that's a little technique that I use every single time I'm dovetailing without fail. It makes the transferring process like completely foolproof because that is generally where a lot of the inaccuracies lie with badly cut dovetails. It's that transfer between the tails and the pins that throws a lot of people off. So if you're going to take any tip from this, take that one, because I guarantee that is going to instantly improve, as the title says, your dovetails. Now, the fifth and final technique is actually a technique that I used while cutting the houndstooth dovetails on the corner of my bench here. And I didn't make a big deal of it in the videos, but it's something that I'd like to share with you. And it is to do with sharpening. Do not leave. I guarantee you it is not going to be me lecturing you about using sharp tools or anything like that. Because don't worry, I am on your side here. I hate sharpening as much as you. I will try and avoid it as much as possible. This is a more economical, should we say, way of sharpening, so you don't have to do it as often, yet it's going to allow you to enjoy the results of a sharp edge on all of your dovetails, depending on how many you do. Anyway, let me show you. So we've got all of these dovetails here that have been rough cut out while I've been filming this video. And the stage they've been left at is obviously we've sawn out the tails and we have cut across the shoulder line with a coping saw. We just need to chisel down to it now. Now, what you might do is maybe grab this component, and if you watched my video on how to dovetail, you'll take away half the material left and essentially get as close to that shoulder line as you can before putting your chisel into the shoulder line. So then that's going to give you a really, really nice crisp shoulder line, and there's going to be no gaps whatsoever in it. So you'll do this component all the way around, all four sides of it, and it's nice and accurate. Then you'll go to the second component. You'll do exactly the same on all four sides. You'll get it right down to that shoulder line, and so on until the end. Now, if you sharpen your chisel at the start of the dovetailing, it's going to be lovely on this one. But obviously the chisel is deteriorating by the time we get to this one. So when you're chiseling down to the shoulder lines on here, it's obviously not going to be as good as this first one, especially if you're working on a harder material like oak or ash or something like that. Poplar or tulip wood, whatever you want to call it, is pretty forgiving, so it's not going to ding up this edge as much. But the same thing applies if I was doing maybe 20 of these. By the time you get to the end, there is no doubt this is going to be horrible. That one's going to be pretty good. So if I'm doing loads of dovetails, or like I said, the houndstooth dovetail in this case, what I'll do is instead of perfecting all of the components, I will sharpen the chisel first, and I'll take all of the waste round on all four sides down to 0.5 millimeter to the shoulder line. I'm not going to go in the shoulder line, just 0.5 millimeter away. So this chisel's nice and sharp. Let's do that now. Right, so now what I've done is got all of these shoulder lines to within 0.5 millimeter of the actual shoulder line. So I've still got a little bit of material to remove, but it is literally the case of one chop from either side. So now I've removed all of the rough material. I've done all of the tasks that are going to be the most brutal on this edge. Now what I can do is go and sharpen this, get a nice fresh edge on it, and go down to the shoulder lines on all of these components just by doing one little tap on each side. And that's going to give the results of a nice sharp edge on all of these components, as opposed to starting on one of them, getting it all perfect and watch it deteriorate as it goes from, what's it on your side, left to right. Obviously there is going to be some sort of deterioration as you go along, but as long as you're using a good quality chisel and not some like, I don't know, Aldi chisel, or controversial, you know, you get the idea. And obviously that technique isn't just limited to the tail part of the dovetails, you can also do it on the pins as well. It is very, very useful to do when cleaning out the sockets on lapped dovetails, because when you start paring back to those nice knife lines, the last thing you want is for a blunt chisel to start tearing out the timber and create all sorts of atrocities on there. So anyway, there you go. That is 5 tips to instantly improve your dovetails. I really hope it helps you out. And obviously, if you like the video, please do not forget to like the video below. It will help me a great deal. Thank you very much. See you in the next video.